Welcome to the Global Rewire Podcast. My name is Craig Torres, and my co-host is Fabio Natalucci, the CEO of the Anderson Institute. Fabio, I'm going to start today with what could be a controversial question to ask an economist. Is geoeconomics the coolest thing in economics right now?
I'm gonna let Matteo answer that question. That's way to my pay grade to answer that question.
That's right. So our guest today, Matteo Maggiori, he's a Stanford finance professor, but he's also director of the Global Capital Allocation Project, which is studying geoeconomics, one of the hottest areas of economics today, in light of the current policies of trade and realignment around the globe. Before we begin, I'm going to remind everybody that the Anderson Institute is independent. We don't take money from political parties, their influence groups. We have no partisanship whatsoever. We're just here to discuss the data and the facts. So, Fabio, take it away.
First of all, Matteo, welcome and thank you for participating. I'm gonna start with a simple framework question. What is exactly geoeconomics? Is that positive analysis, like normative playbook? How is that different from the more classical international relations, the political economy, everything that I studied when I went to school?
First of all, thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be part of your podcast series. I would say that geoeconomics is the notion that countries like the US or China use the existing trade and finance relationships from their economies to exert influence abroad. So think of the US wants to get a particular outcome from a third-party country and is going to threaten them with tariffs, or maybe it will provide a positive inducement in terms of foreign aid, or it might tell them that they might be disconnected from the world financial system, at least the Western-controlled one, if they don't take the action. Or China might use rare earths and the products that are downstream of rare earths or their threat to withholding them to induce a particular behavior in a foreign entity. And the foreign entity might be a government or it might be a private firm. So that, I think it's a concrete example, but also fits very well the definition. I think it is a very cool area of economics. It's certainly something that I am very excited about. Now, for once, it's not after the fact. We started getting excited about this when it wasn't that excited. In fact, people barely knew what the term geoeconomics actually meant. But to me, it's a great combination of something that really matters for the world. I mean, now it's more obvious than it would have been 3 or 4 years ago, perhaps, that this is really shaping a huge amount of economic activity worldwide. It's affecting everybody's lives. It's something also where economists, and not just economists, but I think social scientists in general, has something to contribute, which I think brings to the second part of Fabio's question, which is, what is this about? Well, I think one thing that is great and exciting is doing precise theoretical work on what is this power, why do you have it, when do you have it, in what dimensions do you have it, and what happens if you abuse it and everybody else walks away from you because they think that they're going to get bullied all the time. Those are typical issues that in the last 50, 60 years of economic thought, we made a lot of advances. Think about them clearly and formally, but also with enough formality that you can take them to the data. And you can do policy counterfactuals, for example. What would happen if we did this? And at the same time, there is a massive shift in data availability. And 10 years ago, you could barely trace data on who owns what around the world or who's trading with whom. Today, we have significantly better data, which makes it exciting to take these theories to the data. I think that's part of the scientific excitement. And of course, there is a lot of policy excitement because, well, this is happening for better or for worse, and we'd like to make it for better if we can.
You hinted at this point between interdependence versus leverage in some sense. Is there a point, like a tipping point, where reduce interdependence, the risking, actually reduce leverage? Does that think about trade concentration, choke point, share, export control, payment system interdependence? Is there a point where when those reduce, actually your leverage goes down?
Yes. So I think one of the things that we've been thinking carefully in our work and is what we call the nonlinear nation of power. At a very intuitive level, think of it as if I control 100% of the payment system, you have to do what I say to the extent that you care about having access. Now, that's probably still true when I control 95%. Why? Because if you're a large country trying to rearrange your economy to only using 5% of the world sort of supply of the services, it's probably going to move prices massively against you. If we're at 70%, the 30% alternative might be very large compared to your needs. So for you, that's a totally viable alternative. So a lot of the power comes from almost completely controlling a particular sector. And that matters in policy. Let me make it concrete. In the US, there is a tendency to say, well, China is never, in the next 5 to 10 years, it is unlikely that in the many dimensions that we can count the usage of the dollar is going to be neck to neck with the US. 10 years from now, we're still going to be the vast majority of that market. That's a correct statement. And from a macroeconomic perspective, that might be very reassuring. From a power exertion perspective, that's a total disaster. Because you lose most of your power when China has become 10% from the current 1 or 2% in most of the usual dimensions that we count. That seems a much more achievable goal, or something that is probably much more likely to happen in the next 5 or 6 years. And so it's very important to have a shift in perspective when you're thinking about power exertion versus the traditional macroeconomic interdependence.
Matteo, when I read your work, I think back to 2005 and economists writing about Bretton Woods too. And when you read those things, it seems like we were in this stable equilibrium that would last forever. China would send us cheap labor and goods, and we get these capital inflows and low long-term interest rates. When I read your work, I think maybe that wasn't sustainable. China wouldn't want to be in a dollar network forever, and in an arrangement with the United States this close. What's your perspective on this?
Oh, I very much share your point of view. I would say that there are two types of instability. The first one is perhaps even nothing to do with China. I think there is this tendency that because you've been safe for a while or central for a while, you're always going to be central irrespective of the policies that you decide to pursue, which I think creates a big sense of complacency. That's true, for example, of US federal debt. 10 years ago, we wrote a paper with Emmanuel Fari where we were thinking about a crisis where the rest of the world runs on the US because the debt has gone too high. And people thought we were totally insane for even mentioning the possibility. But if you look through history, countries have been at the center of the world financial or trade system for a long time, and then they collapse. And it's certainly not a birthright. It's not something that you're always going to have. It depends very much on the policies that you pursue. Now, if you couple that one with a big emerging player like China coming in, they clearly have their own incentives. And as they become bigger and more developed, they're creating their own networks, both for exerting their own power, but also for defending themselves from potential foreign coercion. I mean, again, to make it concrete, if you look at the payment system, China is very active in developing his own ability to process payment. And I think that cuts both ways. Some of it, probably the major immediate concern is facing US sanctions and US pressure using the financial system. The second component is probably more on the offensive side. Once they get to be big enough, very much like the US, they're going to use this system to exert political influence on the countries that become dependent on it. I just don't understand why we would ascribe to them different motives from every other large country in history, including the US. I suspect that they're going to predictably behave in the same way as every other dominant power in these respects.
Is the US, Matteo, becoming a little bit more like China-like, right? If you look at various measures that's been taken in the past few years between industrial policies, export control, investment, outbound screening, is it converging toward more interventionist style? We had a podcast with Luigi Zingales, And he was raising the issue of whether we're reaching a tipping point here, a turning point, where erosion of Fed independence, institutional norms, the ecosystem of trust, plus government management of the economy make the US look a little bit more like the Europe, I guess you and I grew up with a few decades ago.
For sure. I mean, it is a statement of an obvious fact that the current U.S. administration has changed the rule book of institutional norms of the U.S. Massively. And that goes to Fed independence, to certainly tariffs, which is the biggest change in tariffs since probably the Great Depression. These are not things that we've been very familiar with post the Cold War. It's hard to distinguish when I'm interested in doing work on this myself. How much of this is, it would have happened anyway and it's coming from the economics of a competition with China, and how much of it is much more idiosyncratic to the current political situation of the US. I think it's hard to distinguish perhaps the two in the data, but it's, to give you an example of what I have in mind, in research I've already done, like I mentioned the paper with Emmanuel, imagine that you've been the center of world financial markets for a very long time. You have an excellent reputation, and part of how you maintain it is that you get a 2008 crisis, you would have huge incentives to devalue the dollar, pursue very loose fiscal policies, all in the interest of alleviating the short-term pain. Part of the reason you don't do it is you benefit on average from having the dollar in your debt market so central, and so you have to maintain the safety in the face of a crisis. Now imagine that I tell you 15 years from now, no matter what you do, 50% of that privilege is going to accrue to China. Well, clearly your own incentives to take the short-term pain have gone away. You're much more likely to behave opportunistic because the rewards in the future are just not there. You're not going to be the only player around. So those incentives are always there. And I think it's interesting to see a world where we might revert to you're either with me or not with me in terms of alliances, which is not what we've seen, because all of a sudden it seems not that unlikely that some countries will become much more closely integrated with China going forward than the US. And that shifts the incentives for policymaking.
Taking this from the perspective of China, right, and their goal of building resilience and tech autonomy, if we look at, it looks like they're essentially employing the Chinese version of the US playbook. So scale, technology catch-up, market access, building international payment around the RMB, export control. Do you think that is succeeding China at this point, given the goal that it set itself?
I think it's very hard to say, one, because we don't have good data. China makes it very hard to get a precise answer. Second, I would say compared to the traditional playbook of the US that you're referring to, which is probably the one immediately after World War II, that also came with a lot of political freedom. And so China is taking a very different approach on the political side, even if some of the industrial policy and the state incentives on the sort of economic side are reminiscence of some of those investments. It's hard to say to what extent they're succeeding. Also, the word success here, it's a little tricky. Let me flip it this way. Imagine that there's a lot of debate of can we produce semiconductors in the US? And I think that those questions are not well defined in the following sense. One thing is to say, if we needed semiconductors during a war, and we would be very happy to take a loss of $1 billion to produce them, could we do it technically? And another one is to say, a private enterprise on the margin can do it and find it profitable. Those are two different questions. It's like building an aircraft carrier. That also costs $1 billion, and we do it for a reason. If we did it, nobody would think of it as it's going to provide private incentives, and the government does it. So those are slightly different questions. If we define China as winning as they're going to be able to produce some of the advanced semiconductors themselves, that might be true. If we're asking, could they do it with only private incentives and would it be profitable for private investors to do it, that's a slightly different question. They're clearly providing very large subsidies. And it seems unlikely that we're going to be able to keep them that far from the technological frontier for a long period of time just with export controls.
Matteo, when again, reading your work, and also lately I've been superficially reading some of the literature on regime shifts. So you use large language models, and I think it is signaling a regime shift is at hand. So some of the literature says when we pop out of one regime, we just don't go into a steady state. There's a period of nonlinear chaos and things get... So how much time does it take to get back to a new regime in trade and hegemony?
It's a great question. I think economists don't have a good answer, or at least I don't. In part because these are big shifts that occur very infrequently. So we see 2 or 3 over 150 years, which makes empirical work pretty hard. I mean, you can imagine, I studied a lot the shift between the UK and the US, somewhere in between the 2 world wars as the cornerstone of financial markets. That's one big episode. Since then, it's been very dollar-centric with one variety or another of a possible alternative competitor. So it's not something where we have, great data to make precise statements. The part that I think, I can get a little deeper into, which I think is interesting for what we're witnessing right now in the world, is that part of, you mentioned it before, like part of what has changed massively is that the U.S. Administration willingness to employ these instruments of coercion has gone up a notch. And as in particular, I think what has surprised, I believe most economists, certainly me, is the fact that some of these pressures been directed to the traditional close allies of the US, Canada, Western Europe, the UK, not only China, not only sort of small emerging economies. That's causing a big shift. Part of what it's happening is Europe, the UK, everybody's instituting economic security policies, which when they started 10 years ago or 8 years ago, were very heavily tilted towards China. And now I would say a big chunk of that policy discourse is towards the US in terms of economics dependency. That's a massive change compared to the world we've lived in post the Cold War. And I think it's one that we should be worried about because we have sold this narrative, I think, in policy and in economics, that a lot of the constraints of the WTO, the IMF, the rules of the game, were an incarnation of some globalist planner or an incarnation of a gift that the US was bestowing on the rest of the world. And I think that that's a dangerous perspective. And I've only really come to understand it recently myself. It's a dangerous perspective because it's not correct. These were deals offered repeatedly by US administrations in the interest of the US. Why? Because you're telling people, look, you can be in my economic network. I'm not going to bully you all the time. There will be things that I ask you in precise circumstances, but we can trade a lot. And that builds up my power. If you're expecting random bullying all the time, all you do is you walk away from me. And once you walk away from me, I actually have no power in equilibrium. And I think it had become the norm to talk about these rules of the game as if they were in the interest of only the other countries, which might have been a good marketing strategy in some sense to foster participation. But we forgot to explain it to the US public, and the US public has become very convinced that all of these rules were to the benefits of everybody else, and that is causing a massive shift in policy. But if we go back, I don't think that you would ever imagine that if they were in the interest of everybody else alone, the IMF would be a few blocks from the White House, and the head of the World Bank would be nominated. But these institutions never looked to the rest of the world as if they were a gift to them. But in the US, that's very much the policy narrative, and I think that it has become a very expensive mistake, and I think economists are a little bit to blame for it, including me. I've always thought of it as a global planner, but that's sort of an unhelpful perspective.
I want to ask you about Europe. Draghi has been very vocal and critical over the last few months, talking about how this European growth model is fading, vulnerabilities are rising, and there's a risk that Europe becomes like some sort of like marginal bystander here. Do you think that Europe can actually rise to the moment? What are the barriers to do that?
One huge problem with Europe is the absence of fiscal space. It's also something that I bring up repeatedly in the US. There's a lot of talk about things being in a national interest. We're sort of relabeling all sorts of industries and projects to be in a national interest. But there's very few times you get to hear that fiscal space is in a national interest. But I would probably put fiscal space as at the very top of the list in terms of strategic benefits to the US. Because look, we don't know what the world is going to look like 10 years from now. There will be crises, there will be policy shifts. And having fiscal space means buying optionality and flexibility to deal with the future. Europe has no fiscal space. I mean, there's a few countries within Europe that have fiscal space, but for the policies that I think Draghi has been talking about, they're very much a public good to the rest of the EU. So using very concentrated fiscal space from Germany for something that has benefit that accrue very widely in the EU, I think politically might turn out to be very difficult to engineer. So I think Europe is in a much tighter spot than the US. I think there's still plenty that can be done, but I think it has to be away from the illusion that we're going to simply be able to spend our way through it, or that somehow we're going to convince the Germans that they have to do massive industrial policy for everybody else. So I think it has to be much more targeted and realistic than a lot of what at least is the general media conversation surrounding those policies. It reminds me of an Italian song that I think Fabio and I will remember, of like, you set the goals so high that then you can give up with great dignity when you fail. I see some of that dynamic going on.
I mean, there's a time window also, right, when you can actually play an important role. And that time window, at least in my mind, seems to be shrinking. Some of the policies that needs to be put in place are, I don't know, to support innovation, productivity, structural changes, capital markets union. You need to build the ecosystem to actually do that. It takes time, but that window closes much faster than you can actually build that ecosystem. And so you're racing against time here.
Yeah. I think that's totally right. I also, I'm pretty skeptical of old style industrial policy. I think the debate on industrial policy that we're part of, as at least in terms of geoeconomics, it's a little bit misguided because under the word industrial policy, you can fit anything from we're picking winners and national champions, for which we have plenty of evidence that it's a bad policy. It doesn't really work very well. Compared to policies where we're doing essentially Pigouvian taxations and subsidies, like very broad sectors that we think are important. We're giving them subsidies or a tax advantage with tons of competition within the sector. That's particularly important in the European context, because if we start with every time we do industrial policy, one firm has to be in Spain, one in Italy, one in Germany, so that we satisfy all of those constraints. That's a recipe that we have tried. We have plenty of evidence that it's not productive, and it just leads to a lot of inefficiencies and political lobbying. I think if we did sector-wide broad subsidies with a lot of competition, there's no guarantee that the outcomes are not going to be very skewed, with some countries benefiting a lot and others not. And so we're going to have to deal with the consequences of that. But I think that's where the much more of the realistic conversation should be happening. I haven't seen, at least, in the public discourse, a lot of this.
I have to ask both of you, since it was such a factor in the United States, given their renewed interest in defense spending, isn't that going to produce some innovation like it did in the United States, where really the research dollars in the Cold War led to tremendous public sector, tremendous innovations that were then given to the public sector, from GPS to the internet to many other things?
I think that's very likely. Again, it goes back to what I was saying about semiconductors. We can debate whether that's going to be the efficient way to get to those innovations or the cost-effective way to do it. But clearly, I'm here in Silicon Valley. Defense tech and private equity is going through the roof, and a lot of it is technological innovation that is coming from the military. That's also part of, I think, a conversation that I haven't seen as much in Europe, which is the new defense that we need very often has high-tech components that it's not clear we want to necessarily do in the old-style approach of the government doing this directly. Some of it might have to come from the private sector. And how do we set up an ecosystem where private enterprises are willing to take the risks? What are the procurement contracts going to look like? That's a very active conversation in Silicon Valley where, 5 years ago, I think if you were doing defense and private equity, you weren't exactly at the top of the list of things that would be, sponsored publicly. Now you're at the very top of the list. That's sort of the change of times. But it's sort of interesting that conversation is happening. I haven't seen as much of that in the European context.
Okay. I think there's also an issue of the US had an ecosystem in place, right? That involved capital markets, involved universities, involved the Department of Defense. In Europe, you have a very fragmented system. You have a few European defense industries. The idea that you can fund all of this and innovation just with public money without private capital, to me, seems not a very good plan. But to involve private capital, you need capital markets union, which Europe have been trying for decades now. You need a supply chain. So there's some ecosystem requirements that they are not in place. And so you have this intertemporal trade-off now. Do you build the ecosystem? It's going to take long period of time, or do you run for building up defense capacity, which means you need to rely on the US again? That's the intertemporal trade-off, I think. In terms of trade and finance, Matteo, a lot of the discussion has always been about trade now, right? Tariffs and so on. Usually trade and finance kind of travel together in parallel. Do you think it's possible to decouple the trade part and so onshoring, supply chain and so on without having an impact on the global finance that will actually be adverse, have a negative effect for the US, which is still at the center of the global financial system?
It's an interesting question. I joke with my students that for many years, like most professors in international macro, I used to teach balance of payments identities. They're one of the most boring topics on earth, and the students have always recognized that it's among the most boring things they've ever heard. But right now, it's a wonderful topic which gets lots and lots of attention, mostly because there seems to be some basic inconsistencies between the desire to shut down a trade deficit and what that would do to capital inflows, and the simple idea that, in a very basic sense, I cannot at the same time receive large net capital inflows and run a massive trade surplus. There's an identity there that you have to square. But if you go past those statements, I would say that two things have been of interest to me. One is there's been a lot of attention on the trade as an instrument of coercion, whether it is tariffs or sanctions on oil. And when you look at the trade data, with the exception of very, very few heavily concentrated sectors, trade doesn't necessarily generate a lot of geoeconomic power. Fundamentally because most of the things that are traded, economists would say, have relatively high elasticity of substitutions. You can kind of get another variety somewhere else, and it's generally pretty good. It's a close substitute. When you look at finance, it's very different. Finance is a market that is incredibly heavily concentrated in the hands of the US and its Western allies. And it's one where the elasticity of substitutions are likely to be very, very low, because there's a few basic plumbing systems, like, the custody of assets or the ability to make payments, where alternatives are extremely poor. If you're not using that system, you're not quite down to barter, but you're down to extremely poor alternatives. And so they're much more likely to generate power. And so I always found that there's a strange amount of relative attention paid to plain vanilla trade sectors compared to the financial sectors in the policy discourse in general. That's particularly true when you look at, for example, what the US uses to exert power, which other than semiconductors is mostly finance. And even in semiconductors, it's a sector that has a lot of porosity compared to finance. For the US to impose a financial sanction, you need to get a few large banks, a few key financial institutions along, and you cannot have it. The semiconductor pipeline is much more dispersed around the world. So it's a lot more difficult to enforce in practice. The other thing that I would say that, related to what Fabio was asking me is, we're seeing signs of fragmentation everywhere. But I think the fragmentation narrative, it's also easily overdone. I mean, in some sense, globalization has been going like this. We kind of leveled off a little bit. We're at the top. There is no sign of a massive unwind of globalization. There are signs of fraying at the edges. A lot of it is, rightly so, if you're a country that is likely to be sanctioned by the US, you sort of learn from the Russia lesson that you want to try to get your assets out of even Western Europe, and US didn't, control systems. You might be looking to park much more money in China. All of those things are happening at the edges. In trade, there is a lot of retrading. So you need to net out a lot of the activity of, rather than sending things from China to the US, I'm going through Vietnam and Mexico first. But once you net those out, there are some signs that these things are being rearranged in some strategic sectors. But it's the very beginning. Now, I've taken the view that first we shouldn't be as a data fact, we shouldn't over extrapolate. On the other hand, there are good reasons to be worried, because the same forces of agglomeration that on the way up generate a lot of self-reinforcing globalization, once you kick it in reverse, by the other way around, the effect is somewhat symmetric. And so if we start destroying all of these global efficient systems, once we start that process, everybody else is going to start fragmenting more and more. And so you have to be careful about kicking this in reverse. But at the moment, we're in a period of stall, I would say, more than anything else.
So one of the things that I think the economics profession has not done a great job is to think about the distribution effect of globalization, both within countries and within, if you want, part of the population itself. Sector hit more than others. This is also happening at the time of very rapid technological change, right? So some of the change we see in labor market are driven by technology. I'm just curious where you stand in that debate of the distribution impact of globalization versus technology.
I am very much with you in the sense that I have not worked on it myself, but I've felt for a long time that we're not thinking enough about how we need to compensate for the adjustments. That has been true of trade in the US. It's also been true of integration in Europe, where we haven't thought about what this was going to do in the presence of relatively low mobility. Italians just did not get up en masse and move to France or Germany. And we just didn't think carefully about those dynamics. I would say the part that I'm thinking more about now is on the geoeconomic side. There, these conflicts are going to be very apparent. And I think that connects to what you asked me about at the very beginning on are we becoming a little closer to China. So first, it's very clear that things that are in the national interest create a big conflict between the government and the private sector. You and I could come up with a great new technology for warfare or for AI, and it's very clear that after we come up with it, both things are going to be true. It's going to be worth a lot, and the government will want to control it in the national interest. Or if you make it, if you apply it to, say, NVIDIA would like to sell its chips to everybody, potentially restrain the supply to obtain high markups. That's essentially a monopolist. The US would like NVIDIA to sell a lot more to everybody else but China. It wants to flood the market, make it very difficult for China to develop an alternative commercially, and at the same time exclude China. So you can see that that's a conflict. And we've seen a lot of this play out in real life. So we have to think carefully about how we're going to resolve distributional issues between the people that are making the innovations and the government that wants to control it, let alone what's going to happen to the more traditional debate of the lower wage people. That connects to what you asked me at the beginning, because I'm often asked, particularly in public panels, questions that have an undertone that China has a big competitive advantage over the US in exerting geoeconomics power because he controls his firms. And I always think that logic is incorrect in the sense that it's taking the world as given. It's saying, given the industries we have, if the government can more directly sort of direct the firms in the national interest, that's great. But the industries you have aren't a gift of God. They're produced by somebody. The reason we have great finance and great semiconductors is that we let people innovate and retain the private benefits of the innovations that they discover. If we tell them that every time they're going to discover something great in AI or chips, the government will take a 40% stake, surprise, surprise, predictably, we're not going to have an industry that we can use to exert power over anybody because the innovation is not going to be there. So I think you have to be very, very careful with this notion of ex post. The government is going to take it over and do what's best in the national interest, because that quickly runs into a world where nobody wants to innovate and everybody's afraid of the government taking massive stakes in the companies. And we're seeing some of that happening. And it's clearly having big sort of repercussions in terms of innovation incentives.
One thing you and Fabio are both saying, I think I got this right, is the politics express the economics, correct?
I think it's a two-way street.
The economics express the politics.
Yeah, I would say that there's a big interplay there that if we're not careful with, might end up in very undesirable outcomes.
Okay, that's what I wanted to ask. So it seems like, I think it's funny that, India had this meeting with China and Russia, and then we get a tweet. I called my friend Modi and wished him a happy birthday. So it seems like you, in your work, there's a lot of game going on here and testing. And so back to the steady state, just if I can ask you for a forecast, where does this land, do you think, in 2 years?
First of all, as an economist, I'm generally very hesitant to do forecast. Given the current politics, I think I know my R squared to be very, very close to zero. It seems that most people in the administrations are not capable of forecasting the announcements next week. So I'm certainly not capable of doing it. But I think there are some interesting economic dynamics that I think we're going to see at play. One I've already mentioned. It's clear that the traditional Western alliances have been broken to a level that is not going to be put together very quickly, even by a change of a U.S. administration, because this is a much bigger secular phenomenon, and once it starts, I just don't think that that's going to go away anytime soon. So we are seeing Europe rethinking its economic policies and its relationship with the U.S. That's something I would have put very little chance on, 5 to 10 years ago. The same is happening for the UK, for Canada, for Australia. So I think that fragmentation, it's going to keep happening. And the other thing that I think I see more likely is that we're going to end up in a world where rather than having at least at the Western level, one big coalition with a relatively homogeneous set of rules, we're going to end up with overlapping alliances of smaller parts that are going to be much more about specific issues and sectors and a specific set of countries. And so that, in some sense, is a fragmented world. To what extent it can replicate something relatively close to what we had, it's an open question, but that's clearly happening already, and I think we're only at the beginning of that process.
I think with that forecast, before we get into troubles, I think we stop here. And thanks, Matteo, for participating in today's podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Matteo. It was fascinating.
Of course.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.